We're taking a look tonight at, or we continue the series on these lessons from the prophets, and this is going to be one that goes over the next couple of weeks, looking at the writings of Hosea. There's a lot contained in Hosea, a lot of very emotional writing in Hosea. What he writes about is a familiar yet tragic love story, to which we today understand all too well. A man and a woman pledge their loyalty to each other through the bonds of marriage. Then the problems arise. Disagreements come into the relationship, followed by a literal and emotional separation. One is faithful, or one is unfaithful, and the trust of one of them holding them together, but now damaged, now destroyed, has put an end to that marriage. They become so alienated that what started as a great relationship ends in a divorce. That is the account that Hosea writes about. In a relationship, a marriage that he had with a woman named Gomer. He records this tragic account, and he acknowledges, what's interesting about this is he acknowledges the marriage as a comparison to the nation of Israel and how they had left God. And if you've ever read through the account of Hosea, you can see just what a sad and disheartening relationship that becomes with God's chosen people, with Israel. They left their God. They left the one that they were connected to. When you look at Hosea chapter 1 and verse 2, we see at the very beginning of this account what is taking place. He records, when the Lord began to speak by Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go and take yourself a wife of harlotry and children of harlotry, for the land has committed great harlotry by departing from the Lord." It's interesting as we look through this account, God is telling him, "I want you to take this woman," but he doesn't say, God's not telling him, "I want you to go out and choose someone who's in harlotry." And of course, by harlotry we mean someone who is in prostitution. That's who it was back then. But he says, "I want you to go and get this woman. She happened to be this harlot," and he tells him to have this relationship with him. God makes every effort to restore his bride, Israel. And as Hosea goes on with the relationship that he has with Gomer, being that parallel to Israel, we'll see just all the heartache that Hosea has to go through, everything that he has to endure with this marriage to a woman that did not want to be with him, not in the long run. And we see just how hurtful that was to Hosea. And if you can imagine just having God connected to his people and having his people turn on him and choosing someone who replaces God in their life, and how hurtful it must be to the God who did everything so much for them. And so so God makes every effort to restore his bride, seeking to rescue their relationship and reestablish their marriage with its vows. Now, what comes of this, as we're going to be looking at in the next couple of weeks here, we're going to be looking at some of the heartache, some of the reasons that God was not happy and obviously not pleased with it. It does come with a happier ending, with a hopeful ending, but we're not going to get there yet. I want to take a look at some of the things that happened before that, and look at Hosea's emotional account of the reasons that he gives for the downfall of Israel. When you look at Hosea chapter 4, that's where we're going to primarily be in tonight. Hosea 4:6 gives us the first of what we're going to be looking at as over the next couple of weeks here, of why he sees and how he describes the downfall of it. In Hosea 4 and 6. I want to give you a little bit of background, though, first, as the condition of the time of Hosea. Because this really sets it up, and so that we get a better understanding of just why he did what he did, why Israel did what they did, what led to it, and just how vulnerable they can be, how vulnerable we can be if we're not careful. There were two systems of the religious worship that prevailed in Israel. Each one of them was a reproach against God. First off was the calf worship that they had, and we've read about the calf worship. It was the same abomination that Moses had talked about when he was going through the Exodus, and they had chosen this golden calf to worship instead of God. The other one was Baal worship, and we see a lot of Baal worship that happens in the New Testament with the idolaters. Both of them are very paganistic. Both of them got a lot of good people on the wrong side. It led away a lot of really good and strong and faithful people at that. You look at the hearts of Israel, and I've heard so many people say, I would never, ever follow the way that they did. God would always be number one in my life. God, I'll never, ever choose to go against God. And yet we see today, sadly, that that's just not the case. We do fall into temptation. We fall into those trials. We're influenced by the wrong sources. And that influence has such a powerful pull on us sometimes that if we are not careful and we do not establish our standard in God being the authority, it really does not take a whole lot for us to start moving backwards and moving out from under this, the hands and this, the caress of what Christ has with us. We need to be careful of this, and that's exactly what happened to them with this Baal worship. If you look in 1 Kings chapter 12, you don't need to turn there, but in 1 Kings chapter 12, it talks about Jeroboam the first. Jeroboam had introduced the calf worship to them. And through introducing this calf worship, there's a number of things that really violated what God wanted them to do, what he purposed them to do. Number one is that he changed the object of worship, obviously, being the calf. He chose an inanimate object that was crafted by human hands, given a name, and then they chose to worship this object that they had created. It also changed the place of worship. It changed the time of the worship that they were to do, and finally it changed the access of worship. All of these things violated what God intended for the Israelites, these Jews, to put into practice. Israel had plunged into various kinds of sin. They offered illegal sacrifices from these high places. When you read about the high places, as we have in the past, that's where it was. It was this idolatry that they would make these offerings on these altars to these different gods, and anyone except for the God of Israel. They practiced this open idolatry amongst themselves. Women prostituted themselves at the local shrines. This was a very common practice. In fact, when you look at paganism, a lot of it had some very explicit sexual undertones to it. It was just vile with some of the things that they would do. They entangled themselves in alliances with other nations, something that God had very explicitly told them not to do. Remember, early on, God told them, I do not want you to mingle with the people in Canaan, the people who are these idolaters in these idolatrous lands. And there was a reason for it. And it's because as good as these people were, and as much as God had shown them and taught them, the law was very visible among them, and they had access to the law, but he knew that given enough time among these pagan women, all these practices, that it was ultimately going to lead them right out from under what he wanted for them. And so they would entangle themselves. They put their trust in this material armaments instead of in the Lord. They trusted in the carnal armies and military instead of trusting in God. And so all of these play a part in what the condition was at the time of Hosea and why he wrote what he did. But you start to look at the disappointment of Israel. And you see this in the very first part in chapter 4 and verse 6. And notice, as we start to look at this, notice the prophet wrote concerning this problem, my people. This was God telling Hosea, he's saying, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. How personal he made it right here. It wasn't the Syrians. It wasn't the Moabites. It wasn't the Egyptians. He knew that they had already, that they were already not following him. This is God being very personal, God's covenant people. This is how personal God made it between he and them. That's how personal God makes it between him and us. If this was written today, no doubt this would, he could be saying, you had the Syrians, you had the Moabites, you had all these idolatrous people. You put it in today's world, and it could be just all these different false religions that are out there, these denominations. He wasn't pointing to them. He didn't say, they're not a part of me. He didn't say, all these different religions that came about after the Pentecost. He singles them out and he says, my people, because that's how important it was to him. He looks at Christians today, those who are in his church, those who by no other way could be added than by the Lord, and that only happens if we are baptized and repent, as we see in Acts chapter 2. Those are the only people that are his people. He didn't recognize the Gentiles. He didn't recognize the Pharisees as his people. He didn't recognize the Gnostics as his people. He doesn't recognize any denomination that came after the church that was established in Jerusalem in that first century. There's no one. They like to do it. But we know that Christ said, I'm going to build my church. And no one else has the authority to claim that church except for him. No one else has any authority to put any other name that we cannot find in the New Testament than his church. And how personal he makes it with us. And so as we look at what Hosea writes, God said, these are my people. And my people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. I have no doubt that God didn't want to have to do this. That was not what the relationship that he wanted with them. That is certainly not what he wanted them to do, but they put themselves in this situation. And they committed this spiritual infidelity. And because of that, they were going to be destroyed. I think it would have been hard to be a prophet. How difficult it must have been to have to be the bearer of all this bad news sometimes. You look at all these minor prophets, the major prophets, and what they told, the warnings that they would give to these people, and certainly it took a toll on them to have to tell people what's coming. They didn't want to do it. They loved the people. They wanted the best for them just like God wanted the best for them. And they were among them. And so when you see something like this happen, how emotional it must have been for Hosea, and especially going through his own relationship and understanding that his own relationship was a parallel to the nation of Israel. And so when the spiritual infidelity happens and the people are told that they would be destroyed, how he must have hated telling them something like this. And you think about it, this lack of knowledge that he's talking about, it's not because of that they were untaught. This does not mean that they just had a lack of knowledge that they just didn't know. It doesn't mean that they were just mistaken in the way that they did. In fact, if you look at the very next part of 4 and 6, look at what he tells them. He says, you have been destroyed for lack of knowledge, and he says, you have rejected knowledge. That was sort of the key of why all of this was happening and why God was not pleased and why Hosea had to write this entire account in the first place. He's saying, my people are destroyed because they reject the knowledge that I have given to them. God had revealed to them. They had the law. They understood what it was. And yet they did exactly what God told them not to do with mingling with these idolaters and getting all caught up in all of this stuff that replaced God. They rejected knowledge. And he also said they had forgotten the law of your God. In other words, you're not keeping what you vowed to keep. How important that is for us to understand. To make that application to us today. When we go down into that water and we're baptized and we come up that new creature and we're added to the church of Christ. There is a vow that we are making. There's a commitment that we're making. We're telling him that I no longer belong to the world. I no longer put myself in charge. I have a new master. I have someone new that I serve. Someone that makes it much more hopeful than I could have ever even imagined. And I'm making a vow to him that I'm going to serve him and serve him only. And how sad it is when someone who's made that vow, understanding just the complexity of what has happened to their spiritual lives, decides that they want to replace God. That's the infidelity. That's at stake right here. God's word surrounded them. And they turn around and they just did not take advantage of it. They thought they could come up with something better. And that is what was going to destroy them. You look at chapter 5 and verse 4. And it says, they do not direct their deeds toward turning to their God, for the spirit of harlotry is in their midst. I mean, think of what is going on here. This is a people that understood everything that God had given to them. They had gone, you look back at all of the early parts of Moses and the Jews that had come out of Egypt. These were people that were very mindful of all of this. They were mindful of the teaching that Moses came when the law was given to them, when it was introduced to them, when their history was introduced to them for the first time, or when they were given the details of it, knowing that it was their ancestors that went across that Red Sea, out from beneath Pharaoh, that it was their ancestors that took that 80-year exodus, going into the land of Canaan, entering Jericho, overtaking Jericho with the most incredible odds against them, and going through all of Canaan, taking town by town, and finally being able to say that they conquered it and distributing the land. That should have been enough for them. But they get caught up anyway. We get caught up, don't we? It's why it is so important that we cannot forget who we are. We cannot forget what God has given to us and why he has given it to us. There is something special about being a Christian. There is something special about being in his church, about having that relationship with him. And there's absolutely nowhere better that we can be. But nonetheless, he says, I'm going to, as he tells them, he says, the spirit of harlotry is in their midst, and they do not know the Lord. People get offended when others hold them accountable, don't they? We need to realize why. Why do we hold each other accountable? Why do we have someone come to us if they see that we might be drifting in their eyes, or they might be seeing something that we don't, and that happens most of the time. We don't see it ourselves. Why do they come to us? Most of the time, I guarantee it's not because they want to just judge us. Not if it's another Christian. They have our spiritual welfare in mind. They want the best for us. They want to correct us because they want to see us go to heaven. And when we turn around and we do that to someone else, we need to think the very best of that individual. Not judge them, not ridicule them, not make them feel ashamed in any way, but we do need to hold each other accountable. We need to realize why that happens, so that we do not fall into what Hosea is talking about right here. These were people that could have held each other accountable. These were people that could have decided to, going in that direction, to turn back towards God, to restore that relationship. You look at restoration, it's been happening. We tend to think of the restoration as happening only here in the United States, as this movement that happened at the end of the 1700s and into the 1800s. And we see all these big names that come up with the American Restoration movement. These men, and certainly we're grateful for that. And we're grateful for the work that men did during that time. Men like Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell and J.D. Tant and all of these great preachers that left denominationalism to restore New Testament Christianity and tried to get others to do the same because they knew that denominationalism was not a Bible concept. And we're grateful for the hard work that they did in trying to restore New Testament. But that's not the only restoration that's happened. Restoration's been happening for years, and it happened, we were able to see it in the New Testament. It could have happened with these individuals. But as Hosea said, they just got further and further away. The spirit of harlotry was in their midst, and they did not know the Lord because of it. And so we see the consequences of rejecting God's word. You look in verse 6 further. And he says, I will also reject you from being priest for me. I also will forget your children. You go into verse 7, it says, the more they increased, the more they sinned against me. And I will change their glory into shame. How did it get like this? These were people who were so on fire for God. People who understood several years prior to this what he had accomplished for them. But it had gotten to a point where absent in the land was truth and mercy and a knowledge of God and a yearning to learn more about what this law was all about, a yearning to get closer to Him. And it was replaced with swearing and profanity, lying, killing, stealing, adultery. That's what they had become. Sound familiar? How interesting that if we didn't know when this was written, Hosea could have been easily writing about America. Because we see that same kind of harlotry happening here. How many congregations have given up their stand on certain doctrinal issues? How many have compromised the worship service? How to worship? The authority for worship? And trying to please man. Trying to make it as attractive as they can so people to draw people in. How many have started compromising the road to salvation? How many have compromised what happens inside the worship service with what is allowed and not allowed? It ought to get us thinking. It ought to fire us up, if nothing else. See, this lack of knowledge that he's talking about right here, they knew what the law said. They knew what they should have been doing, and they just didn't do it. This is a willful ignorance because of an unwillingness to study and an unwillingness to comply to it. We look at something like this and we ask how could something so wonderful become something so heartbreaking? And then it kind of hits you that we, just like them, are going to stand before God to give an account. It's sobering, at the very least, isn't it? To realize that we could be as vulnerable as they are. I said at the beginning that this is just, it's a tragic love story. Don't make that relationship with God that tragic love story. I'm grateful for this congregation. I'm grateful for the leaders of this congregation and the people of this congregation and standing for the truth. We know that There are congregations struggling. Encourage them. Pray for them. Pray for this one. That will never ever get to that point. As we look through this whole account, it's an eye-opener to realize what can happen if you're not careful with it. We're going to be looking at some of the other things that Hosea said with it. Like I said, there's a happy ending that's coming. We just got to get there, which we will in just a couple of weeks. The hopeful part for us is that it does not need to go the way of Israel. It does not need to go the way of Gomer. You can turn to Christ tonight. If you have not been where you need to be, if you have started compromising that relationship with God, know that it doesn't have to stay that way. You can fix that. You can turn it around. Hosea pled for the people to turn. We're going to look next week, and I'll reiterate this again when we meet again. One of the most riveting things that God ever told Hosea, when he lost his wife, when she left him, when she went after someone else, God told Hosea, you go get her. That's how important we are to him. God wants his people. He wants you. And if you need to come to him tonight, please know that you can do that. You have a chance. As together we stand and sing.